All right, welcome back to part 2 of the Create PT rubric quiz. All right, now we are on problem number 10, which means we are moving on to rows 4 and 5. All right, so problem number 10 and 11, all right, relate to this response. All right, so it says use the following code segments and responses for questions 10 and 11. All right, so we see the definition of an on-mouse press. All right, and then we have this stuff inside of the function. All right, and then we see an on-mouse press call here. All right, so it says the procedure I wrote is called on-mouse press and takes parameters mouse X and mouse Y. When the procedure is called by the user clicking on the canvas, the coordinates of the click are passed into the procedure for the values mouse X and mouse Y, which will determine whether the if or the else is executed. Okay. All right. So now let's take a look at row 4. All right. The written response includes 2 program code segments, one showing a student developed procedure. All right, with at least one parameter that has an effect on the functionality of the procedure. One showing where the student developed procedure has been called. All right, so let's take a look. This is not a student developed procedure. On mouse press is a built-in part of the Python in CMU CS Academy. And so this is not a student developed procedure. And so right away, that means we cannot earn row 4. So the response earns a point for row 4. Number 10 is false. All right, but now we still have to take a look at row 5, right? These two are independent. All right, so row 5, the written response includes a program code segment of a student developed algorithm. So now here's the key. It doesn't matter that it wasn't a procedure that was student developed or a procedure at all. Now we're just looking at the algorithm that was selected. So now forget about the procedure part. Just take the algorithm, so here, all right, and determine if it has, well, remember, sequencing, selection, and iteration. Remember, sequencing, multiple things done in a row. All right, selection, so an if or an else. Okay, an iteration, a loop. Does it have sequencing, selection, and iteration? Remember, sequencing, does it have more than one line of code? Yes. Selection, does it have an if and an else? Doesn't have to have an else, but it does. So if and else, yes. And then does it have a loop? Yes. So we have a repeated portion of code, right? And so, okay, it does that. Now, it explains in detailed steps how the identified algorithm works in enough detail that someone else could recreate it. So let's look, okay? All right, when the mouse X value is between 100 and 300, the user will be prompted to enter a number of scoops, which will determine the number of scoops the ice cream cone will have that is drawn on the canvas. The first scoop is drawn will be filled with the first color in the colors list. Second loop will be filled with the second color, and so on. If the mouse X value is not between 100 and 300, a label will appear on the canvas telling the user to click closer to the center of the canvas. Is that what this does? So it says if mouse X is greater than 100 and less than 300, right? Then do all this stuff, right? Which is what was described. The loop is described, right? Saying that, the first color is going to be the first circle and so on, right? And then the else is, well, what happens if you don't click in the center, right? And so that is sufficient to earn the point for row 5. So we would say the answer for number 11 is true. Okay. Let's move on to 12 and 13. All right, so 12 and 13. Now we have a similar portion of code, right? But it's different. All right, so now we see a definition of a draw cones function. So now, okay, this is named by whoever was programming, right? This is not an on-mouse press. And so this would count as a student developed procedure, right? So go back to row 4. Okay, one showing a student developed procedure with at least one parameter that has an effect. All right, so this has 2 parameters, but do they have an effect? Does mouse X or mouse Y matter? Well, it says if mouse X is greater than 100 and mouse X is less than 300. So now the value of mouse X matters, and so that means the parameter has an effect. It does not matter that mouse Y is not used because the scoring guidelines just say with at least one parameter that has an effect. So this has one parameter that has an effect. The mouse Y value does not have an effect because it does not show up anywhere here. Okay, then it says one showing where the student developed procedure is called. So do we show where it's called? And the answer is yes, right? The draw cones procedure is called in the on mouse press. Doesn't matter how it's called. It just matters that the draw cones function is being called, right? All right, but then does it describe what the identified procedure does and how it contributes to the overall functionality of the program? Well, let's read. The procedure I wrote is called draw cones, and it takes parameters mouse X and mouse Y, which uses the user click to prompt the user to click again, or to prompt the user to enter a number of scoops they would like to draw. This procedure is essential for the program as it allows the user to initiate and customize the drawing. So, have they identified what the procedure does and how it contributes to the overall functionality? Yes. And so row 4 here would be true. Yes, the response earns the point for row 4. But now let's take a look at row 5. All right, row 5, remember, okay, sequencing, selection, and iteration in the selected code. All right, so we see selection, right? We see if, we see else. Obviously, sequencing, there's more than one line of code, but there is no loop. And so there is no iteration. This code would not repeat. And so we would say the response does not earn the point for row 5. So row number 13 is false. All right. And we don't even actually need to read the rest here, explains in detail enough steps because they already didn't earn row 5. All right. Let's move on to 14 and 15. All right. 14 and 15, same thing now. Okay. We are looking at rows 4 and 5 once again. All right. So we see definition, draw cones, mouse X, mouse Y, right? Once again here. All right. And then we see the draw cones function is called. All right. And so we want to keep moving on and let's consider, all right, go back to row 4. All right. One showing student developed procedure with at least one parameter that has an effect, one showing where the student developed procedure is called. So does at least one of the parameters have an effect? Mouse X, yes. Mouse X. Okay, mouse X, yes. So mouse X does have an effect on the procedure. All right, mouse Y does not once again, but it only needs to have one. And then do we actually call the function draw cones? Yes. All right, so now it says, the procedure I wrote is called draw cones and takes parameters mouse X and mouse Y, which uses the user click to prompt the user to click again or prompt the user to enter the number of scoops they would like to draw. All right, now, okay, it says describes what the identified procedure does and how it contributes to the overall functionality of the program, which that does not take place there. So the response for row 4 is false. This does not earn the point. Once again, because the response does not talk about how it contributes to the overall functionality of the program. All right, let's move on to row 5 then. All right, so number 15. All right, does this have, remember, sequencing, selection, and iteration, right? So going back here, does it have sequencing? Yes, more than one line of code. Selection, yes, it has the if and the else. And we have the loop here, right? And so there is iteration. All right, so that's good. Now, explains in detail enough steps how the identified algorithm works in enough detail that someone else could recreate it. All right, so now let's read. The procedure is called by the user clicking on the canvas, and the coordinates of the click are passed into the procedure for the values mouse X and mouse Y, which will determine whether the if or the else is executed in the algorithm. When the mouse X value is between 100 and 300, the user will be prompted to enter a number of scoops. The number the user enters will determine the number of scoops drawn, and the first scoop is drawn will be filled with the first color in the colors list. The second loop will be filled with the second color, and so on. If the mouse X value is not between 100 and 300, a label will appear on the canvas telling the user to click closer to the center. And so that means that this would earn the point because the response does describe in enough detail that it could be recreated. All right. And so that is problem number 15 would be true. All right, let's move on to problems 16 and 17. And now that means we are looking at row 6. So let's move on our scoring guidelines to row 6. All right, so question 16. All right, so we see this draw cones function, right, that would have been identified in response 3C, but now in 3D, we are talking about two calls to the function, right? And so let's go back to the scoring guidelines. The written response describes two calls to the selected procedure, right? Okay, so there are two calls, draw cones 5200, draw cones 220-300. All right, great. But it says, okay, each call must pass a different argument or arguments that causes a different segment of code in the algorithm to execute. All right, so are the arguments different? 5200, 220, 300. Yes, these are different things. But do they cause a different segment of code to execute? So mouse X is 50, okay? So now if we look here, if mouse X is greater than 100 and less than 300, well, that's not true, right? So that means the if would not execute, which means the else does, okay? But now draw cones is 220, 300. So mouse X is now 220, okay? So if mouse X is greater than 100, yes, and less than 300, yes. And so now if 220 is mouse X, then the if will execute, right? And so going back here, do the calls pass different arguments? Yes. That cause different segment of code in the algorithm to execute? Yes. Right. And so that would be fulfilled. But now we need to look, describes the conditions being tested by each call, and then identifies the results. All right. So now keep going down. The first call would pass the value 50 for mouse X into the procedure, which would cause the if statement to be false. Thus, the else statement would execute. Okay, so that is true. That's what we said earlier. The second call would pass the value 220 for mouse X into the procedure, which would cause the if statement to be true and execute, which is true. All right, result of the first call. The output for the first call would be a label appearing on the canvas telling the user to click closer to the center. Result of the second call. The second call would prompt the user to enter a number, which would then determine how many scoops are drawn on the ice cream cone and produce the drawing to the canvas. So the answer, well, yes, this would earn the point for row 6 because all elements in the scoring criteria are met. All right, so going back, 16 is true. All right, let's move on to 17. All right, so now problem 17, same thing. All right, so we have this function here. First call, draw cones 120, 100, draw cones 190, 300. All right, so once again, two different calls, right, with different arguments, right? 120, 100, 190, 300. All right, so now 120 and 190 are the mouse X values. So 120, mouse X greater than 100, yes, and mouse X less than 300, yes. So the if would execute for the first call. All right. Now draw cones 190, 300. Mouse X is 190. Mouse X greater than 100 and less than 300, yes. And so the if would execute. So now the key here is that these two calls, while the arguments are different, they cause the same portion of code to execute. And so that would not meet the criteria, right? Because it says each call must pass different arguments, which it does, but that cause different segment of code in the algorithm to execute, which is not true. And so the answer for 17, regardless of what else is written there, is false. This response does not earn the point for row 6. All right, so that concludes part 2